Hello everyone, in this video I will talk about the belief in witchcraft from history to the present day. First of all, if you want to continue making videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's move on to our video. Diving into the depths of the history of witchcraft means stepping into one of the darkest, most complex, and at the same time most fascinating aspects of human history. This is because the figure of the witch was born from humanity's helplessness in the face of the unknown, from its fears, hopes, anger, and its reactions to everything it could not explain. In all of history, no concept has managed to be both terrifying and alluring at the same time as successfully as witchcraft. A witch could be seen as a healer distributing remedies, an outcast living on the fringes of society, or a figure believed to threaten the religious order. The idea of the witch acquired a different meaning in every culture, yet it always symbolized humanity's confrontation with its own darkness. Humanity's relationship with nature forms the oldest roots of the concept of witchcraft. Long before the discovery of fire, people did not know why lightning struck, how the stars shined, or where illnesses came from. This realm of the unknown was the first magical space of the human mind. The sounds heard in the darkness at night, the howling carried by the wind, the sudden sandstorms appearing in the desert, the shadows moving across the sky, each of these was perceived as a sign of a supernatural force. As long as Homo sapiens did not understand nature, they assigned meaning to it. These meanings evolved into rituals, and rituals into magic. Archaeological findings show that the earliest magical rituals go back to the most ancient periods of human history. In Paleolithic cave drawings, we find figures of sorcerers, half-human, half-animal shamans, horned figures, people dancing in a trance. These images laid the foundations of early humans' beliefs in both nature and the supernatural. In essence, what we call witchcraft originates here. Humans needed invisible forces to make sense of the things they could not control. When healer women discovered the properties of plants, their knowledge was perceived as magic by their communities. This knowledge was sacred, but also dangerous. It could save lives, but when used incorrectly, it could also cause death. According to anthropologists, shamanism and sorcery are among the oldest defense mechanisms of the human mind. Just as a child imagines a monster under the bed when afraid of the dark, early humans believed that invisible forces lay behind the natural events they could not explain. These forces could be good or evil. The tribe's shaman claimed to communicate with these forces and guided the community accordingly. When conflict arose within the tribe, when someone's illness worsened, or when a hunt failed, the shaman would explain the situation by claiming to have received messages from unseen entities. Although these beliefs may seem irrational today, they once served as mechanisms that preserved social order. However, witchcraft turned into a bloody historical phenomenon much later, with the rise of settled civilizations, especially the emergence of monotheistic religions. As monotheistic religions spread, pagan beliefs rooted in nature and spirits came to be seen as a threat. As Christianity spread rapidly across Europe, it sought to erase centuries-old local traditions by labeling witchcraft as the work of the devil. Pagan villages' celebrations of spring, fertility rituals, offerings to forest spirits, all once normal cultural practices, suddenly became illegal. Women who engaged in these rituals, especially midwives, healers, and elderly women knowledgeable about herbs, were coded by the church as potential servants of the devil. Yet many of these women were among the most knowledgeable and experienced members of their communities. The dark face of witchcraft took shape during this era. Throughout the Middle Ages, people lacked the scientific knowledge needed to explain natural disasters, famines, epidemics, and political crises. Therefore, blaming an invisible enemy became the easiest solution. When cows fell ill, crops failed, babies died, or people succumbed to high fevers, the first suspect was often a woman who lived alone and was perceived as strange. Most of these women were individuals excluded from society, people who struggled to make ends meet, or those who kept to themselves. These socially marginalized figures became convenient scapegoats in times of crisis. The psychological basis of witch accusations runs deep. Humans dislike uncertainty. In situations they cannot control, they seek someone to blame. Assigning blame creates the illusion that events are controllable. For example, during the devastating Black Death pandemic of the 14th century, millions of Europeans died. There were no scientific explanations, the concepts of germs and bacteria had not yet been discovered. Thus, people believed that such a massive catastrophe must have a supernatural cause. Jews, foreigners, people of different faiths, and especially elderly women were blamed for the plague. Thousands were executed under accusations of witchcraft. Society alleviated its collective panic by sacrificing victims. The church gained immense power through this fear. Creating an invisible enemy made the population easier to control. The belief that witches could be anywhere increased distrust among people. This strengthened the church's role as the protective authority. The emergence of witch hunters stemmed from this psychological and political atmosphere. Witch hunters traveled from village to village claiming to identify witches, and people, out of fear, gave them money and support. In many places, witch hunting became a lucrative occupation. The period between the 15th and 17th centuries saw the most intense witch hunts in Europe. During this time, the publication of the book Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, was an attempt to systematize witchcraft as if it were a scientific subject. The book claimed that women had weaker wills and were thus more easily seduced by the devil, deeply misogynistic ideas that became foundational to the text. It served as the theoretical backbone of witch hunts across Europe. It detailed methods for identifying, interrogating, and torturing witches. Under these methods, the accused could never prove their innocence. Any confession obtained under torture was accepted as truth. After this period, witch hunts became widespread, systematic massacres. In some regions, nearly half the population was accused of witchcraft. In places like Bamberg and Würzburg, witch trials were so extensive that nearly every resident was questioned at some point. Authorities confiscated property, families were destroyed, and communities were consumed by decades-long paranoia. Sometimes even entire families, villages, or cities were collectively accused of witchcraft. One of the most horrifying aspects of witchcraft history is that the vast majority of accusations targeted women. This was not only due to religious beliefs but also the social structure of the time. In male-dominated societies, independent women, those who did not marry, had their own businesses, possessed economic power, or had specialized knowledge, were seen as dangerous. These women were labeled witches because they stepped outside the roles imposed by society. In this sense, witch hunts were historically a tool for suppressing women. In the end, the concept of witchcraft became a dark symbol that still persists in the subconscious of societies today. As the centuries unfolded across the vast and restless territories of Europe, the Old World found itself continuously reshaped by forces both visible and unseen. Yet beneath the shifting political borders, beneath the rise and fall of kingdoms and churches, there persisted a quieter, more dangerous current, an unbroken thread of belief that the world was not governed solely by divine will or human ambition, but by hidden hands, spirits, curses, and malevolent influences. And in the eyes of many, especially during moments of fear, illness, famine, or uncertainty, these forces found their human representatives in the figure of the witch. What made the notion of witchcraft so resilient was not merely superstition. It was its ability to adapt, to evolve, to reshape itself to the psyche of each era. In rural villages where education was scarce, witchcraft lived as a simple explanation for the cruel randomness of life. A child's sudden illness, a cow's infertility, a fire that spread too quickly, everything incomprehensible gained an answer, and that answer often rested on the shoulders of the most vulnerable women in the community. But as Europe marched toward the Renaissance and later the early modern era, witchcraft transformed from a collection of local fears into a structured, almost institutionalized concept of cosmic rebellion against the established order. By the late medieval period, the Church began shaping witchcraft into something far more threatening than folklore. What had once been village superstition re-emerged as a theological crime, a conscious alliance with the devil, a deliberate attempt to undermine Christian civilization. It was no longer the simple charm maker or herb mixer who stirred suspicion, it was the alleged conspirator in a vast satanic network, supposedly capable of influencing weather, livestock, sexuality, infertility, and the health of the community. And as these fears hardened into dogma, a vast machine of accusation, prosecution, and punishment slowly awakened. But the question that often arises is this: how did societies, advancing in architecture, literature, philosophy, and science, still cling so tightly to the fear of witches? The answer lies partly in the psychological landscape of the time. Amid wars, plagues, climate anomalies, and social upheavals, the human mind instinctively sought patterns, causes, culprits, reasons for suffering. The witch became the embodiment of hidden danger, the personification of all that could not be controlled. This psychological mechanism helped entire communities redirect their fear toward a single target, turning chaos into a narrative that felt manageable. Yet the tragedy deepened, for witchcraft accusations were rarely random. They followed invisible lines of social hierarchy, gender roles, and economic tension. Widows with no male protection became easy suspects. Women who lived alone, women who bore grudges, women who refused to conform, women who aged without children, all fell under suspicion not because of supernatural acts but because society offered them no safe place to exist. Witchcraft was not just a religious fear, it was a reflection of deeper anxieties, about female autonomy, about social disorder, about the mysteries of the human body, about misfortune, and ultimately about mortality itself. As the early modern period dawned, these anxieties hardened into legal structures. Courts began to treat witchcraft as a prosecutable offense, often with rules so vague that almost anyone could be accused. Torture, endorsed under the belief that witches served Satan and would lie under normal questioning, became a standard investigative method. Confessions extracted under agony were accepted as truth, and each confession, naming additional witches, spread panic into new territories. In this way, a self-perpetuating cycle emerged. The more witches the courts found, the more convinced society became that a vast satanic conspiracy truly existed. The witch hunts were not mere eruptions of madness, they followed patterns. Periods of environmental stress, harsh winters, crop failures, epidemics, coincided with spikes in witchcraft trials. When communities felt helpless, they demanded explanations, and authorities, seeking control, supplied those explanations by identifying witches. In this sense, the witch hunt became a cultural tool for restoring order, even if only temporarily, by sacrificing individuals to satisfy collective fear. But another layer must be understood. The intellectual climate of the time played a significant role. Scholars, theologians, and legal experts produced works that framed witchcraft as both a spiritual and political threat. Books like Malleus Maleficarum did not merely describe witchcraft, they created a blueprint for identifying and prosecuting witches. These texts blended superstition with logic, fear with authority, shaping the minds of judges, clergy, and ordinary citizens. Witchcraft became a scholarly matter, debated in universities, preached in sermons, encoded in law. It gained legitimacy not through evidence but through repetition, through institutional endorsement. As the idea of witchcraft spread across borders, each region reshaped it according to its own cultural anxieties. In Germany, the fear attached itself to weather and agriculture. In Scotland, it focused heavily on the devil's physical presence and pacts sealed with ritual. In France, accusations often revolved around poisoning and love magic. In England, the belief mixed with political unrest, eventually becoming a tool in larger conflicts. Each version of witchcraft was different, yet all shared the same underlying psychological architecture, a fear of the unknown projected onto the bodies of those least able to defend themselves. And so, as Europe approached the era of scientific awakening, the witch hunts intensified rather than diminished. It was as though the closer humanity came to rational explanations, the more desperately it clung to ancient fears. At the same time, controlling the narrative of witchcraft gave authorities immense power. It allowed kings, church leaders, magistrates, and even local governors to assert moral authority, to punish dissent, to regulate behavior, and to shape communities through fear. A society susceptible to the idea of witchcraft was a society easier to command. Yet amid the crushing weight of prosecution, voices of skepticism began to emerge. Physicians questioned whether illness truly came from spells. Some judges challenged the use of torture. A few philosophers argued that belief in witches stemmed from ignorance rather than theology. These voices, at first isolated, gradually formed the intellectual foundation that would dismantle the witch-hunting machine. But the process was slow, spanning generations, hindered by cultural pride, institutional resistance, and widespread superstition. During this long transitional phase, countless individuals continued to suffer. Families were torn apart by accusations, children orphaned, communities fractured. The psychological impact was profound, for fear reshaped the everyday behavior of people. Neighbors became cautious, avoiding arguments or even casual complaints lest they provoke suspicion. Women suppressed their knowledge of herbs, healing, or childbirth, a devastating blow to traditional female wisdom, because such knowledge could be misinterpreted as witchcraft. Social interactions became laden with anxiety, as every word, every gesture, every misfortune could become evidence in an accusation. And still, despite the fear, despite the danger, the belief in witches remained widespread. It persisted because it filled a void, an emotional, psychological, and cultural void created by uncertainty. The witch answered questions about suffering. The witch offered a target for collective pain. The witch allowed societies to externalize their fears, to blame individuals instead of confronting larger, more complex problems. And as long as those deeper problems remained unresolved, poverty, disease, inequality, patriarchal control, the belief in witchcraft could not truly disappear. Even in regions where skepticism grew, witchcraft survived as folklore, as whispered stories, as symbols of rebellion or taboo knowledge. The transition from literal belief to metaphorical representation happened slowly, unevenly, shaped by the pace of social transformation. By the time many courts abolished witchcraft as a crime, the cultural imagination remained deeply influenced by centuries of fear and fascination. This legacy would shape literature, art, theater, and eventually modern film, embedding the archetype of the witch into the core of Western storytelling. But the deeper truth remained: the history of witchcraft was never merely about magic. It was about the human mind, about how fear transforms communities, about how societies handle suffering, about how power uses belief to maintain control, and about how ordinary people become symbols in struggles larger than themselves. This truth would echo across continents for centuries, influencing not only Europe but the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, where witchcraft beliefs found new forms and new contexts in colonial and post-colonial eras. And as the world continued to change, politically, religiously, intellectually, the concept of witchcraft remained, shifting between myth and reality, between fear and fascination, between persecution and empowerment. The next chapter of this long and complex story would unfold not only in courts and churches but in the collective consciousness of entire civilizations. Yet as the belief in witches spread across borders, it did so unevenly, creating a patchwork of attitudes that varied dramatically from one region to another. In some areas, witchcraft was seen primarily as a domestic threat, something that occurred within the walls of the home, in disputes between neighbors or within families. In others, especially in regions with a strong tradition of folk magic, witchcraft was nearly indistinguishable from everyday practices of healing and protection. Herbalists, midwives, and wise women often held positions of respect until misfortune struck, at which point their knowledge became suspect, their skills reinterpreted as dangerous, and their status reversed overnight. This fluidity between healer and witch is one of the most striking aspects of early modern social life. The same woman who delivered a baby safely, provided remedies for illness, or helped livestock recover could, under different circumstances, be accused of causing harm. In a world without formal medical systems, these women filled a critical role. Yet because their knowledge operated outside the control of male authorities, religious, legal, or academic, it was perpetually vulnerable to suspicion. The fear of witches was also a fear of unregulated female knowledge, of wisdom passed down through generations without institutional oversight, rooted in oral tradition rather than sanctioned doctrine. At the same time, the broader political landscape played a dramatic role. Europe was not merely a collection of villages and towns but a continent fractured by religious transformation. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation created a climate of extraordinary tension. Regions adopted new doctrines, abandoned old ones, and found themselves embroiled in conflicts that reshaped identities. In many places, religious authority became unstable. And in times of such instability, anxieties about morality, purity, and social cohesion intensified. Witchcraft became a way to enforce boundaries, to identify enemies, and to reaffirm communal loyalty. Theological debates about witchcraft often went far beyond local concerns. Scholars argued about the nature of the devil, the possibility of demonic pacts, the limits of human free will, and the signs of supernatural influence. These debates, though couched in academic language, filtered down into popular culture, shaping how ordinary people interpreted strange events. Sermons warned of demonic presence. Printed pamphlets recounted lurid stories of witches flying through the night, attending sabbats, or cursing infants. These tales reinforced the idea that witches were not merely sinners but agents of chaos itself, conspiring with dark forces to undermine Christian order. Yet amid all this, there existed a parallel world of folk belief, older than Christianity itself, rooted in pre-Christian customs. In these traditions, magic was not demonic but natural, a part of the world's rhythm, a means of engaging with forces that shaped life. Charms, talismans, protective rites, and seasonal rituals persisted quietly in the countryside, often blending with Christian symbolism. This coexistence created a cultural tension. On one hand, people practiced benign forms of magic to protect themselves. On the other, they feared harmful magic, imagining witches as those who twisted natural forces for destructive purposes. This duality made witchcraft accusations especially potent, for the line between acceptable and forbidden practices was never entirely clear. As these beliefs evolved, trials and executions spread across Europe with alarming intensity. Yet contrary to popular imagination, the witch hunts did not erupt everywhere with uniform violence. Some regions saw only a handful of trials, others, such as parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland, experienced waves of prosecutions that claimed thousands of lives. These patterns reveal a complex interplay of local politics, community tensions, legal structures, and leadership. In places where secular courts held greater authority, trials tended to be more methodical and rigorous, though still prone to error. In areas where religious fervor dominated, witchcraft accusations could spiral out of control with terrifying speed. At the center of many witch panic events were charismatic or authoritarian figures, judges, clergy, or local officials, who believed fervently in the presence of witches and used their positions to pursue them aggressively. Their actions often reflected personal ambition or ideological conviction as much as genuine fear. But these individuals did not operate in isolation, they were supported by communities that saw witch hunts as a necessary form of purification. In a sense, witch hunts offered emotional catharsis, allowing communities to externalize internal conflicts, punish outsiders, and reaffirm social norms. The psychology behind this phenomenon reveals unsettling truths about human behavior. Humans are deeply social creatures, and in times of crisis, they seek unity. Accusing witches created a powerful sense of collective identity. People who might otherwise quarrel found common purpose in identifying, judging, and condemning supposed witches. This dynamic, known today as scapegoating, has appeared throughout history in various forms, against minorities, against political opponents, against the poor, against women. Witchcraft was merely one manifestation of this broader pattern. But the emotional cost to those accused, and to their families, was profound. Accused individuals often endured isolation, fear, humiliation, and physical agony. Torture, widely accepted as a legitimate investigative method, coerced confessions that confirmed the beliefs of the interrogators. The more the accused resisted, the harsher the methods became. And when confessions finally emerged, they often contained details shaped by cultural expectation: flying through the night, attending sabbats, transforming into animals, or engaging in obscene rituals. These stories, while fantastical, were accepted because they aligned with the theological narrative constructed by authorities. The tragedy deepened when the accused named others under the pressure of interrogation. This process, known as chain accusation, allowed witch hunts to spread rapidly, pulling neighbors, relatives, and even entire communities into a spiral of suspicion. A single accusation could ignite a chain reaction, creating waves of panic that overwhelmed legal systems and ripped communities apart. This was not merely mass hysteria but a structured collapse of trust, driven by fear, authority, and the need for simple explanations. Over time, skepticism began to take root, not because people suddenly abandoned belief in witchcraft but because the scale of the hunts became impossible to ignore. Some judges observed that confessions obtained under torture were unreliable. Physicians began attributing illness to natural causes rather than curses. Philosophers questioned whether the devil truly had the power attributed to him. And slowly, the intellectual foundations of witchcraft crumbled. But this transition was uneven, resisted by those who saw witch hunts as necessary for moral order. Even after many courts abolished witchcraft trials, the belief in witches persisted in the public imagination. Folktales continued to warn of hidden dangers. Families whispered stories of curses and omens. Rituals meant to protect against witchcraft survived well into the modern era. And in places far from Europe, in the colonies, in Africa, in the Americas, European ideas about witches mixed with indigenous traditions, creating new hybrid beliefs that shaped communities in unique ways. Yet the story of witchcraft is ultimately a story about human nature, our capacity for fear, for imagination, for cruelty, and for belief. It reveals how societies respond to uncertainty, how power shapes narratives, and how individuals become symbols in struggles larger than themselves. It is a story that stretches across continents and centuries, linking ancient rites to modern myths, medieval courts to contemporary culture. As the early modern era unfolded, the intensity of witchcraft fears reached its peak, manifesting in waves of prosecutions that spread across Europe like dark storms. These were not random nor isolated incidents, they were deeply rooted in a convergence of political upheaval, religious transformation, economic instability, and the fragile emotional landscapes of communities under pressure. Each region developed its own pattern of accusations, shaped by local customs, power structures, and collective anxieties. Yet beneath this diversity lay a shared psychological foundation, the search for control in a world that often felt violently unpredictable. The regions most affected by the witch hunts, primarily the German-speaking territories, parts of France, Switzerland, and Scotland, were areas marked by fragmented political authority. Small principalities, bishoprics, and free cities often operated independently, with their own legal systems and religious hierarchies. This fragmentation created fertile ground for panic. In territories where rulers wished to assert power or demonstrate piety, witch trials became tools of both governance and ideology. The more fragmented a region was, the more vulnerable it became to the cascading effects of fear, rumor, and accusation. Within this volatile environment, entire communities could find themselves engulfed in witch hunts that lasted months or even years. The process often began with a single misfortune, a crop failure, a storm that destroyed harvests, a sudden illness, or the inexplicable death of livestock. These events became catalysts, igniting old suspicions and unspoken resentments. Neighbors who had clashed over property boundaries, debts, inheritance disputes, or personal grudges suddenly found those tensions reframed as evidence of witchcraft. The accused person might have been strange, outspoken, reclusive, poor, or simply unlucky. Once suspicion took root, rationality dissolved. The legal systems of the time amplified these tensions rather than calming them. Confession was considered the ultimate proof, and confession was almost always extracted through coercion or torture. Interrogation methods varied widely but shared one common purpose: to force the accused to admit guilt and to identify accomplices. This meant that trials almost never ended with a single suspect. Instead, each confession, shaped under physical and psychological torment, produced new names. These new names produced more trials, more interrogations, and more confessions, creating a chain reaction that could engulf entire towns. Some trials reached catastrophic scales. Würzburg and Bamberg, two episcopal territories in the Holy Roman Empire, serve as chilling examples. In Würzburg, hundreds of people were executed within just a few years, including children as young as 9, clergymen, members of wealthy families, and respected officials. The accusations became so broad that people of all social classes found themselves vulnerable. Rumors circulated that entire streets might soon be emptied. The city was consumed by terror, its identity reshaped by the relentless pursuit of invisible enemies. Bamberg's trials were similarly devastating. The Prince-Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, known as the Witch Bishop, built a specialized prison called the Hexenhaus, the Witch House, where torture devices filled the halls and confessions were produced with alarming frequency. Elaborate records were kept, documenting interrogations, accusations, and the seized property of the condemned. These records reveal a community trapped in a nightmare of its own making, driven by leadership that believed wholeheartedly in the necessity of purging evil from the land. Yet not all regions succumbed equally to such extreme measures. England, for instance, despite having its own notorious hunts, executed far fewer people than continental Europe. English law prohibited the use of torture except in cases involving treason, which meant that confessions had to be obtained more subtly. Nevertheless, witchcraft trials in England produced their own version of moral panic, especially during the era of Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general. Hopkins traveled from village to village during the English Civil War, exploiting chaos and uncertainty to hunt supposed witches. His methods may not have involved the elaborate torture devices of continental Europe, but they relied heavily on psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and invasive examinations. In just a few years, dozens of women were executed based on his techniques. Scotland, by contrast, experienced some of the most brutal witch hunts in the British Isles. Influenced by Calvinist theology and a rigid moral culture, Scottish courts often pursued accusations with a level of fervor that rivaled continental Europe. The combination of strong religious authority, widespread belief in the devil's power, and a legal system open to coercive interrogation created conditions that allowed fear to spread rapidly. In some Scottish towns, accusation patterns resembled those of Germany, with chain reactions of trials that devastated communities. A key element in these hunts was the belief in the witch's pact with the devil, a concept emphasized heavily in Christian theology. The idea that an individual could make a formal agreement with Satan, gaining supernatural powers in exchange for loyalty, became central to the legal definition of witchcraft. This belief transformed witchcraft from simple harmful magic into an act of ultimate rebellion against God and society. It positioned witches not merely as harmful individuals but as conscious collaborators with cosmic evil. This made their persecution not only permissible but righteous in the eyes of authorities. Under torture, many people confessed to such pacts, describing encounters with demonic figures, rituals in the forest, mark-making ceremonies, and sabbats where witches gathered to worship Satan. These descriptions were remarkably consistent across regions, evidence not of real events, but of shared cultural mythology reinforced by courts, clergy, and interrogators. The sabbat, one of the most iconic elements of witchcraft lore, was less a product of individual imagination than a collective fantasy shaped by leading questions, theological writings, and expectation. The accused often repeated whatever they believed would end their suffering. Throughout this period, witch trials also intersected with broader societal anxieties. Economic hardships made communities more likely to blame misfortune on malevolent forces rather than systemic issues. Warfare destabilized populations, bringing famine, displacement, and distrust. Religious conflict heightened sensitivity to questions of morality and purity, encouraging people to interpret signs of disorder as evidence of supernatural corruption. In many ways, witch hunts became a symbolic attempt to restore order in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Yet beneath all of this lay a gender dynamic that cannot be ignored. The overwhelming majority of the accused were women, and not by accident. Patriarchal structures, assumptions about female fragility, and medieval medical theories about the female body all contributed to the belief that women were more susceptible to the devil's influence. Women who lived outside societal norms, those who remained unmarried, those who were sexually assertive, those who were poor or old or mentally ill, were especially vulnerable. Their marginalization made them ideal targets in times of crisis. Despite the pervasive fear, there were always voices of skepticism. Some judges refused to allow trials based on spectral evidence or rumors. Some theologians argued that the devil was not as powerful as commonly believed. Some scholars insisted that natural explanations should be sought for strange events. These voices grew louder in the late 17th century, gradually shifting the intellectual climate. But in the height of the witch hunts, they were often drowned out by the roar of collective panic. By the time the witch hunts began to decline, tens of thousands of people had been executed, and countless more had been accused, shunned, or traumatized. The hunts left a profound mark on European memory, shaping cultural narratives that persisted long after courts stopped prosecuting witches. Even as Enlightenment thinkers dismantled the legal and theological foundations of witchcraft, the imagery of witches, flying through the night, stirring cauldrons, whispering curses, remained embedded in folklore and imagination. But the global story of witchcraft was far from over. Beyond Europe, in the colonies and in cultures untouched by European legal systems, new forms of witchcraft belief evolved, sometimes influenced by European ideas, sometimes rooted in entirely different traditions. With this expansion came new forms of conflict, fear, and cultural negotiation. As we progress into the fifth chapter of this long and unfolding narrative, the story of witchcraft enters a new era, an era shaped by expanding empires, global trade, religious diffusion, and cultural transformation. No longer contained within isolated villages or regional belief systems, the concept of the witch began to travel, evolve, and adapt across continents. What once emerged from local fears now became part of a larger, interconnected web of human belief. Witchcraft acquired new meanings, new symbols, and new political uses, shaped by the ever-shifting contours of global history. By the late medieval and early modern periods, Europe had already established a deeply entrenched framework of witchcraft prosecution. Yet, beyond Europe's borders, an equally rich and complex evolution was taking place, often overlooked, yet pivotal to the global story. Many societies across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific developed their own unique interpretations of supernatural harm, spiritual imbalance, and ritualized control. These cultural systems were neither primitive nor derivative, they existed long before European contact and had their own internal logic. But with the rise of colonialism, globalization, and cultural encounters, these beliefs faced profound transformation. Colonial expansion fundamentally changed the landscape of witchcraft beliefs. European empires, carrying with them a rigid, demonized concept of witchcraft, imposed their own frameworks onto the societies they conquered. In many cases, they reinterpreted indigenous spiritual practices as sorcery, devil worship, or pagan magic, often misunderstanding or deliberately mischaracterizing the cultural systems they encountered. Traditional healers, shamans, herbalists, and spiritual leaders, once respected pillars of local communities, were reframed as threats to colonial authority. This reframing served a political purpose. By labeling indigenous practices as dangerous superstition, colonial administrations justified the suppression of local autonomy. Every ritual, chant, or medicinal remedy became suspect. Colonial powers used witchcraft accusations as a means to undermine community cohesion and reinforce their own dominance. This dynamic created lasting disruptions, fracturing belief systems, eroding traditional practices, and reshaping spiritual identities for generations. Yet while colonial influence was profound, it did not erase indigenous understandings of supernatural harm. Instead, it created hybrid belief systems, where older cultural frameworks blended with imported religious doctrines, forming new and complex expressions of witchcraft. In parts of Africa, for example, traditional beliefs in ancestral spirits and protective magic coexisted with Christian demonology, producing a dual system of supernatural interpretation, one rooted in ancient cosmology, the other in colonial theology. This fusion gave rise to new forms of fear, as spiritual forces were redefined through the lens of sin, salvation, and divine punishment. Similarly, in Asia, long-standing traditions, such as shamanism, Taoist ritual practice, and Buddhist cosmology, interacted with Western notions of sorcery during the colonial era. Ritual specialists found themselves caught between cultural worlds, navigating shifting alliances and new forms of regulation. In some regions, witchcraft became a symbol of resistance, a way to preserve local identity in the face of foreign rule. In others, it became a source of internal conflict, as communities struggled to reconcile ancestral beliefs with imported ideologies. The Americas, too, witnessed dramatic transformations. Indigenous cosmologies, rich with concepts of spiritual imbalance, shape-shifting, and healing magic, were confronted with European demonology and missionary doctrine. Practices that had once been integrated into daily life were pushed underground, preserved in secret, or blended with Christian symbolism in new syncretic forms. From the Amazon rainforest to the plains of North America, the encounter between indigenous spirituality and European religious control fundamentally reshaped the contours of belief. As these global transformations unfolded, witchcraft also became deeply tied to economic and social change. In many post-colonial societies, accusations of witchcraft emerged as expressions of anxiety about modernity, fears of inequality, wealth disparity, or rapid social transformation. A sudden rise in fortune, unexplained illness, or a tragic accident could trigger suspicion. Witchcraft became a language through which communities expressed their unease with shifting power structures. In this way, witchcraft continued its ancient function, providing narratives for misfortune, offering explanations for uncertainty, and projecting collective fears onto vulnerable individuals. But the modern era introduced new dimensions to these beliefs. With the spread of global communication, mass media, and scientific knowledge, witchcraft found itself reinterpreted yet again. In some societies, it became a metaphor, a cultural symbol used to describe corruption, betrayal, or invisible forms of influence. In others, it persisted as a very real fear, shaping interpersonal relationships, community dynamics, and even local legal systems. The dual existence of witchcraft, both symbolic and literal, reflects the ongoing tension between tradition and modernity. At the same time, anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists began to study witchcraft not as superstition, but as a profound expression of human social organization. Their work revealed that witchcraft accusations often emerge during moments of social fracture, when communities experience rapid change, when individuals feel threatened, or when power structures shift. Witchcraft beliefs act as social signals, revealing underlying conflicts, anxieties, and imbalances. Far from being irrational, they reflect deeply human strategies for navigating uncertainty. This academic perspective introduced a new chapter in the global story, the recognition that witchcraft is not merely a relic of the past, but a living, evolving system of meaning. Today, in many parts of the world, witchcraft retains a powerful presence, sometimes feared, sometimes respected, sometimes commercialized, and sometimes reimagined as cultural heritage. It exists in multiple forms at once, as spiritual practice, as cultural narrative, as political tool, and as psychological symbol. With this transition, the global history of witchcraft enters a complex and multifaceted phase. The forces of colonialism, globalization, modernization, and cultural resilience have shaped it into one of the most adaptive belief systems on Earth. And as the modern world continues to change, rapidly, unpredictably, and often chaotically, the role of witchcraft continues to evolve, reflecting the persistent human need to find meaning in uncertainty. As we enter the sixth and final segment of this expansive journey, the narrative of witchcraft approaches a turning point, one shaped by the rise of scientific thought, rational inquiry, and the transformation of global societies. The Age of Reason did not simply challenge old beliefs, it reshaped the very foundations of how humanity understood nature, the mind, and the universe. Witchcraft, once a dominant framework through which people interpreted misfortune and mystery, now faced the full force of intellectual revolution. The 17th and 18th centuries marked a profound shift. Scientific thinkers such as Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and René Descartes introduced new methods for understanding reality, methods grounded in observation, mathematics, and experiment. Natural phenomena that had long been associated with supernatural forces, storms, eclipses, illness, earthquakes, were gradually explained through natural laws. This shift weakened the foundation upon which accusations of witchcraft had stood for centuries, the belief that unseen beings actively manipulated the world. With the rise of Enlightenment philosophy, legal systems began to question the validity of spectral evidence, confessions under torture, and the testimony of frightened communities. Judges, scholars, and clerics started to argue that rational societies could not rely on superstition to determine guilt. Witch trials declined dramatically. In some regions, they disappeared almost entirely. Yet this decline was not purely intellectual. It was also political. Centralized states realized that witch trials were socially disruptive and difficult to control. By limiting or abolishing them, rulers gained greater authority while reducing the influence of local courts, village leaders, and religious factions. The transformation was as much about power as it was about reason. During this same period, medical science began to identify natural explanations for behaviors once associated with witchcraft. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, dissociative episodes, sleep paralysis, and certain neurological conditions were slowly understood through medical research. As the language of illness replaced the language of possession, the social space for witchcraft accusations narrowed further. The human mind, once feared as a vessel easily infiltrated by spirits, became a subject of psychological study. But even as Western societies moved toward rationalism, witchcraft did not vanish globally. In many regions, it continued to function as a way of interpreting social conflict, economic inequality, or emotional distress. In some places, it became more deeply ingrained than before, responding not to ignorance but to the pressures of rapid modernization. Witchcraft, paradoxically, gained new relevance in the modern world. As the 19th and 20th centuries unfolded, anthropologists documented the persistence of witchcraft in various cultures, revealing patterns that transcended geography. Accusations often arose in periods of tension, during economic crises, political upheavals, or generational conflict. Witchcraft functioned as a symbolic language, a means through which people expressed fears that could not be openly spoken. It became a mirror reflecting issues such as inequality, social fragmentation, and moral change. In industrialized societies, witchcraft re-emerged in unexpected forms. Spiritualism, occult revivalism, esoteric movements, and neo-pagan traditions gained traction among those seeking meaning beyond material progress. The rise of parapsychology, seances, and ritual magic in the 19th century represented a cultural backlash against the rigidity of rationalism. Later, in the 20th century, modern witchcraft movements such as Wicca reframed witchcraft as a spiritual practice, one rooted in nature, creativity, and personal empowerment rather than fear or accusation. For the first time in history, being a witch became a chosen identity rather than an imposed label. Meanwhile, mass media reshaped the global imagination. Novels, films, television, and digital culture transformed the figure of the witch from a feared outcast into an object of fascination, fantasy, and symbolism. Witchcraft became a narrative device, a way to explore themes of power, otherness, morality, and rebellion. The witch, once hunted, now thrived in the pages of literature and the frames of cinema. Yet the darker legacy of witchcraft accusations remains alive in many parts of the world. In some societies, individuals continue to face violence or exile due to fears of supernatural harm. These modern witch hunts, though far fewer than those of the past, reveal how deeply rooted the mechanisms of suspicion, projection, and scapegoating remain in human psychology. They remind us that the fear of the unseen is not easily erased, and that the social conditions which give rise to witchcraft accusations persist. At a deeper level, the story of witchcraft reflects a fundamental human struggle, the tension between uncertainty and explanation, between fear and understanding. Witchcraft rises when societies face the unknown, when illness spreads without cure, when fortunes change suddenly, when old systems collapse. It emerges from the human need to assign meaning to suffering, to locate the source of misfortune, and to impose order on chaos. Looking across thousands of years, witchcraft appears not as a relic of superstition but as a cultural constant, shifting and evolving as humanity itself transforms. It has been a tool of accusation, a form of resistance, a spiritual pathway, a political weapon, a narrative symbol, and a psychological projection. Its endurance suggests that the human mind gravitates toward stories that bridge the gap between the visible and the invisible. As this long documentary narrative draws to a close, we stand at the intersection of history, belief, and imagination. The world today is shaped by scientific knowledge unimaginable to our ancestors, yet the patterns that once fueled witchcraft accusations persist, in conspiracy theories, moral panics, social scapegoating, and the search for hidden forces behind every crisis. Witchcraft endures not because people still believe in spells and spirits, but because the underlying structure of fear, uncertainty, and meaning-making remains embedded in the human condition. The story of witchcraft is ultimately the story of humanity itself, its fears, its hopes, its conflicts, and its unending attempt to interpret the mysteries of existence. It reminds us that every society, no matter how modern, carries within it echoes of its past. And it invites us to question how we confront the unknown today, with reason, with fear, or with stories that help us navigate the shadows. Thus concludes the final chapter of this extensive exploration, a journey through belief, power, psychology, culture, and history. The tale of witchcraft does not end here, it continues to evolve, shaping and reshaping itself in every generation. For as long as humans seek explanations for the inexplicable, the specter of witchcraft will remain, lingering at the edges of the world we think we understand. For more informative videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.